He who does not remember must live through once more. Thoth Hermes. Do you ever wonder why the world feels wrong? Not broken in the way of collapsing economies or failing systems, though those too crumble, but in a more ancient, silent way. As if something was once full and sacred, and now lies half-forgotten beneath layers of distraction. As though the ground beneath our civilization is not just soil and stone, but sedimented memory, compressed myths, forbidden prayers, echoes of voices we no longer recognize as our own. They told us that what is gone is myth, that lost means false, that when the gods withdrew, they left behind nothing but statues and superstition. But have you never stood before an ancient carving, a forgotten manuscript, a song with no known origin, and felt the pull? That sense of something vast and close, something that stirs not in the intellect but in the marrow. Hermes Trismegistus knew this ache. His lament to Asclepius is not merely a prophecy. It is a soul's whisper passed through time. A whisper of decline, yes, but also of return. They will mingle with men, he said of the powers who come when light recedes. And is that not what we see now? A world veiled in noise, guided by those who speak not of truth but of possession. The insane called wise, the seeker called mad, the luminous silenced, exiled into the margins of superstition. But who gets to decide what is superstition and what is sacred? Look closely at the patterns of this forgetting. It was not chaos that consumed the wisdom of the ancients, it was design. There came a moment when sacred knowledge was no longer dangerous because it was misunderstood, but because it could awaken. Egypt's gods were not destroyed by foreign swords, they were exiled by domestic blindness. And Hermes, in his grief, watched the temples become tombs, the prayers become dust. He did not weep for the gods, he wept for us. Imagine a land that mirrored the heavens, not as metaphor but as manifestation, where stones spoke in geometry, where the breath of the priest was tuned to stellar rhythms, where law and magic, science and soul were not enemies, but limbs of the same divine organism. What does it mean that this place was real? What does it mean that it was left behind? This is not about nostalgia. It is not about recreating robes and rites and hieroglyphs. It is about memory, sacred memory, not stored in history books or digital archives, but in you. Yes, you. What if you came here to remember? You do not need to be told the world has fallen out of rhythm. You feel it, in the dull hum beneath the constant doing, in the dissonance between what is praised and what is right, in the subtle grief you carry when you see beauty ignored or wisdom ridiculed. That is not weakness. It is resonance. Your soul reacting to the silence where there should be song. Hermes spoke of a time when people would cease to revere the universe, when light would be rejected, when souls would forget they were immortal. And then, he said, the earth would burn, the sea would churn, the stars would fall out of place. And yet, after fire, after flood, after pestilence, there would be a rebirth, a new song, cosmic restoration. What if we are in the pause before that song begins? You have felt it, haven't you? The restlessness, the whisper, the feeling that something within you remembers a world of deeper order. Not a utopia of technology or politics, but a civilization aligned with something beyond itself. A world that pulsed with the breath of stars. That world was not perfect, but it knew how to listen. This is the moment between forgetting and remembering, between sleep and awakening. And the path back is not through conquest or proof, it is through resonance. You do not need to convince anyone. You do not need to debate. You only need to feel the echo. So I ask you, what have you forgotten? And what is it that is beginning now to stir, quiet but insistent, beneath the surface of your daily life? Let that question carry you. The next part will enter the sacred ruins of Egypt, not as archaeologists, but as those who once walked those halls barefoot, with memory in their bones. They say Egypt is a tomb, a cradle of civilization, long emptied of its soul, catalogued in museums and classrooms, reduced to statues and sand. But they do not tell you that Egypt breathes, that beneath the sterile gaze of tourists and textbooks, something ancient still pulses in its stones. Have you ever wondered why a simple hieroglyph carved into granite can stir something inexplicable inside you? Why the silence of those great temples feels more like a presence than an absence? Because these places were never meant to be visited. They were meant to be remembered. Hermes said, "In Egypt, all the operations of the heavens are present on earth." He wasn't being poetic. He was revealing a map. The temples aligned with stars, the chambers resonant with frequency, the rituals timed with cosmic rhythms. Each structure was a living instrument, designed not to worship, but to harmonize, to tune the human soul back into the order of the universe. But what happens when the music stops? There came a time when that resonance was no longer heard, not because it ceased, but because we lost the capacity to receive it. The temples remained, but the codes were broken. The priests were silenced. The meanings were erased intentionally. Do you think it was accident that Theodosius declared the old gods illegal? That the mystery schools were burned, the scrolls consumed in flame, the last hierophants executed or driven into exile? It is easier to control a people who forget. What if I told you that forgetting was not an accident of history, but a weapon? That every time a sacred library was destroyed, every time a language of the gods was translated into lifeless syllables, a veil was drawn tighter around your consciousness? And yet, despite every effort to erase it, something remained, etched in the walls, carved into stone, preserved not by ink, but by intention. The ancients understood that language dies, but resonance does not. This is why Hermes spoke of a time when only the stones would remember. Because they do. When you walk among the ruins of Dendera, Karnak, Abydos, when you stand in the shadow of the Sphinx or beneath the gaze of Osiris, you are not visiting a dead past. You are entering a living field. And if you are quiet enough, still enough, willing enough, you can hear it. Not with ears, with soul. Have you ever felt it? That strange wave of emotion that arises without cause as you approach a temple? That inner trembling as if some forgotten part of you is trying to surface? That is not imagination. That is memory. Not yours alone, but collective, archetypal, ancestral. Memory stored not in thought, but in vibration. The Rosetta Stone unlocked the glyphs. But the real language of Egypt is not phonetic. It is harmonic, symbolic, fractal. It does not speak to the intellect. It speaks to the soul's architecture. And what it says over and over again is simple: you were not meant to forget. And so I ask you, when you see the Eye of Horus, do you recognize it? When you hear the name Thoth, does something shift in your breath? When you read the word Ma'at, do you feel the weight of truth in your chest? This is not history. This is a summons. You did not come into this world to be a passive observer. You came as a carrier of codes. You came with memory encrypted in your marrow. The glyphs are not outside you. They are you. And each one is a key waiting not to be read, but to be felt. The ancients did not pray as we do. They tuned. They aligned. They remembered. You are not meant to worship the gods. You are meant to remember that they were metaphors, windows to aspects of the greater self. Isis is not an idol. She is the intuitive intelligence within you. Osiris is not a myth. He is the resurrection of soul from the fragmentation of form. Anubis guards not your death, but your passage into awakening. The pantheon is a mirror, and the temples, they are reminders. So I ask you again, what stirs when you see the broken statues, the worn steps, the faded walls? Could it be the part of you that walked there long ago, now waking from its sleep? In the next part, we will step beyond the glyphs and into the silence, into the moment when the flame was nearly extinguished and memory was locked beneath centuries of forgetting, into the deliberate dismantling of the sacred, and into the question, what does it mean when even the stones can no longer speak? There is a silence more dreadful than absence, a silence that follows erasure, the kind that lingers not because no one is speaking, but because what was once alive has been deliberately muted, not killed, but calcified, encoded so deeply that only those who carry the resonance can awaken it. You know this silence. You feel it in museums where sacred relics are displayed behind glass, labeled with sterile names, drained of their pulse. You feel it in textbooks that compress millennia of wisdom into footnotes. You feel it when you try to speak of intuition, and are met with the weight of modernity's smirk. This silence began with law. In 381 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius signed a decree that outlawed all pagan rites and philosophies. A single signature severed the final chords to Egypt's priesthood. The temples were closed, their initiates hunted, their teachings banned. Not debated, erased. What remained were walls no one could read and gods no one dared name. But this was not just politics. It was the enforcement of amnesia, a divine forgetting. Imagine a world in which geometry was a prayer, where light and sound were not tools of entertainment but sacred instruments, where the measure of a man was not his power, but his ability to perceive the hidden order behind the visible one. Now imagine that world declared illegal, not because it was false, but because it was too powerful to be permitted. Power, after all, must be centralized, and memory decentralizes it. When the priests fell silent, the glyphs followed. For 17 centuries, no one could read them. Even the stones, Hermes warned, would one day become mute. And they did. Their symbols reduced to decoration, their teachings distorted into myth. Egypt was not just colonized. It was quieted. This is how you bury a truth without destroying it. You let it be seen but not understood. You let it be remembered, but only as fantasy. You let it be preserved so long as it is misread. But some memory refuses extinction. In 1799, a shard of basalt was discovered by accident near the Nile. A stone inscribed with 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Rosetta Stone. It would take decades, but the code was eventually broken. Language returned. But did wisdom? To decipher is not the same as to understand. Reading a glyph phonetically does not awaken the energy it holds. You can speak the word Ankh without tasting its breath. You can pronounce Ka and Ba without invoking the dance between soul and form. What was unlocked was the shell. The pulse remains hidden. Why? Because the glyphs were never just language. They were resonance. They required not eyes but memory, not translation but initiation. And so the silence remains, just subtler. You can walk through the temples of Egypt today with a guide reciting facts. You can hear the measurements, the dates, the theories. But none of that will explain why you feel tears rising for no reason in the hypostyle hall of Karnak. Why your chest tightens at the Osirian in Abydos. Why you dream of a place you've never seen and awaken with a sense of homesickness. Because something in you remembers what cannot be taught. So I ask you, who were you before the forgetting? What language do you speak when you are silent? When your mind quiets, whose song begins to rise? The burning of the Library of Alexandria, another orchestrated rupture, was not just the loss of scrolls. It was the severing of a bridge. Almost 1 million volumes consumed by fire. Writings on astronomy, medicine, vibration, sacred architecture, soul migration. Works by scholars like Eratosthenes, who measured Earth's circumference with near-perfect accuracy. All vanished, and in the wake of that loss, a dark age of flattened minds and narrowed skies. A world that would, centuries later, declare Earth flat again, as if to mock what had once been known. But what if the knowledge wasn't lost, only buried? What if it survived in coded myths, oral traditions, and symbols misunderstood by design? And what if you, yes, you, are one of the souls seeded into this time to retrieve it? The ancients did not just record knowledge in stone. They recorded it in DNA, in resonance fields, in archetypes that cross cultures and epochs. The hermetic teachings, the chants of the Gnostics, the diagrams of the Pythagoreans, they survived because they were never merely taught. They were remembered. And now the remembering begins again. But it will not come through institutions. It will not be delivered through screens or degrees. It will arrive as a tremor in your perception. A strange magnetism toward forgotten things. A curiosity that borders on devotion. A recognition of symbols that make no rational sense, but awaken tears nonetheless. In the next part, we will speak of those symbols, of the deliberate erasure of the others, the higher beings Hermes once spoke of, and how, even now, they remain encoded in your myths, your scriptures, your sky. Because what if the gods were never meant to be believed in, but remembered? There is a curious pattern in the stories of empire. Wherever a monolith rises, be it political, religious, or ideological, memory becomes the first casualty. Not the outer kind found in scrolls or archives, but the inner one, the kind etched into the soul, passed through breath and bone, carried in silence. And always, before the forgetting is complete, a final decree is issued. Forget the others. This command comes in many forms. Sometimes it is spoken from pulpits. Sometimes it is chiseled into law. Often it is wrapped in the language of salvation. But its purpose is singular, to sever the human from the more than human, to flatten the heavens into a hierarchy ruled by one, and exile all others into shadow. Have you ever wondered what it means when a god says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me"? Whose voice is that, really? In the sacred dialogues of Hermes, the others were not threats. They were teachers, not jealous but luminous, intermediaries between the infinite and the incarnate. They were called powers, sons of the divine, Elohim, netters. They appeared in forms that frightened and awed, beings with wings, with animal heads, with radiant bodies too large to be fully human. And yet, they walked among us, not as myth, not as symbol, as memory. Plato spoke of them, entities who lived longer, understood more, and carried knowledge beyond the stars. He did not believe them into being. He remembered them. He said, quite plainly, that what he knew of the cosmos came not just from logic, but from the priestly teachings of ancient Egypt. Why, then, are we taught to view such beings as fantasy? Because the presence of the others destabilizes the system. Their memory reminds us that divinity is not monopolized, that power is not vertical but webbed, that revelation does not come through one prophet alone, but through many voices, many visions, across many lands. And so came the campaign of erasure. Moses demanded the destruction of all graven images. Joshua instructed his people to forsake the gods of their ancestors. The Sumerian sky people, the Egyptian shining ones, the pre-flood watchers, they were all rebranded. Where once there was multiplicity, now there was silence. And beneath that silence, fear. But ask yourself this: why such urgency to erase a memory, if it were only a fiction? Why the burning of temples, the slaughter of initiates, the outlawing of names? Because some stories were not meant to be disproven. They were meant to be drowned. And yet they rise. They rise in our dreams of beings from the stars. In the ache we feel when gazing at constellations too old to name. In the strange recognition that comes when we read the myths of cultures not our own, and feel as if they are speaking directly to us. What if the gods of old were not invented, but encountered? What if their exile from our collective narrative was not a liberation from illusion, but a descent into it? There is a silence in our spiritual traditions where there should be symphony. A narrow corridor labeled truth, and all else discarded as superstition. But the ancients knew better. They knew that divinity wears many faces and speaks in many dialects. That angels, devas, star beings, netters, and messengers are not different entities. They are different frequencies of the same infinite spectrum. To remember them is not to regress. It is to expand. So I ask you, who taught you to be afraid of multiplicity? What part of you recoils when you hear of higher beings, despite the part that feels drawn? And what happens if, instead of resisting that pull, you follow it? Hermes warned of a time when only messengers of destruction would remain. Those who stir war, spread lies, seduce the soul into forgetfulness. Have you seen them? In the words that divide, in the images that numb, in the institutions that demand obedience in place of wonder? But he also promised their time would pass, that after the flood, the fire, the silence, creation would sing again. Not because the others return, but because we remember that they never left. You are not alone. You never have been. The higher beings do not demand worship. They ask only that you rise into the memory of your own divinity, that you stop pretending to be powerless, that you reclaim the ancient lineage that predates nation, religion, and doctrine. and that you remember what it means to be human, not as animal but as bridge. In the next part, we will step into the myth of the burning world. We will watch as the Creator, not a bearded judge, but the source itself, begins the reordering. Not through vengeance, but through rhythm. Not by descending from on high, but by awakening within you. Because the restoration of the cosmos begins not in the stars, but in your remembering. There is a moment in every great myth where the world is unmade, not as punishment, but as return. A deluge not of rage, but of rhythm. A fire not of vengeance, but of recalibration. When Hermes spoke of the Creator watching as disorder spreads across the earth, it was not a tale of divine abandonment. It was a pause, a breath drawn before the note that begins the new song. He said the sea would churn, the soil would rot, the heavens would no longer hold their orbits. But he also said this: the Creator will look upon what has passed and will cleanse it by will alone. Not a will of domination, but of love. What if the collapse we witness around us, the fires in our forests and in our politics, the floods that drown borders and truths alike, is not merely destruction, but the friction of forgotten order realigning itself? What if entropy is not the end, but the field through which harmony is restored? The ancient ones never feared fire. They revered it. They called it the purifier, the transformer. They built their rites around it, not to summon destruction but to invoke rebirth. Fire consumes the false, so that the true may be seen again. Look around. What is burning in your life? Perhaps it is not the world collapsing, but illusion. Not your identity dissolving, but the mask. Not hope fading, but the false hopes, so that the deeper one may rise. Hermes foresaw this, how the Creator would act not through lightning bolts or miracles, but through the pulse of nature reawakening. He saw how the dark would be burned out, how the air would be cleared not by decree, but by fire. The pestilence would come, not as curse, but as mirror. The flood, not as punishment, but as reset. And after it all, the world would be reborn. Do you feel it? That strange sense that something is closing, and something else, unknown, unnamed, is beginning? That old institutions are cracking under their own weight, that old systems are disintegrating not because of sabotage, but because they were never in alignment to begin with? This is not chaos. This is the law of rhythm. The ancients knew it. What rises must fall. What dies must seed new life. Everything breathes, even civilizations, even souls. And so I ask you, what if your pain is not random, but rhythmic? What if your personal crisis is not a derailment, but a recalibration? What if your heartbreak is the fire that clears the forest for a deeper growth? This is not metaphor. This is the physics of spirit. The same intelligence that moves galaxies moves you. You are not separate. You are a thread in the great unraveling and weaving of what is to come. And when Hermes spoke of this making again of all things good, he was not describing utopia. He was describing remembrance, a world reordered not by force, but by resonance. A society not governed, but attuned. Nature restored. Love returned. Wonder no longer shamed. But none of this begins in the sky. It begins in you. You are not a spectator in this myth. You are the axis around which it turns. The new earth does not descend. It emerges through the awakening of those who carry its code. Yes, the fires will come. The systems will fall. The noise will grow louder before it dissolves. But do not mistake the sound of collapse for the death of meaning. It is the silence after, the breath before the rebirth, that is sacred. And so I ask again, what is being burned away in your life? What old gods, old beliefs, old versions of yourself are cracking open? Can you stand in the fire, not as victim, but as vessel? The Creator is not waiting to intervene. The Creator is already acting through you, through your questions, through your tears, through the quiet decisions you make each day to choose truth over comfort, soul over role, presence over performance. In the next part, we will follow that current into the new rhythm, into the remembered cosmos, into the pulse of Ma'at, the balance that has always been not enforced but lived. Because the world you long for is not in the future. It is in resonance. The ancients did not speak of law as we do. To them, law was not a list of punishable offenses or bureaucratic decrees. Law was rhythm, a sacred tempo woven into the breath of stars and the stillness of stones. They called it Ma'at, not a goddess to be worshipped, but a state to be lived. Ma'at is not a concept. It is alignment. Truth was not an abstract idea in this rhythm. It was a frequency. Justice was not retribution, it was resonance. Every act, every word, every thought either upheld the balance or fractured it. The soul was not judged by doctrine but by vibration. Upon death, it was weighed not by angels or demons but by a feather, the feather of Ma'at. And only a heart as light as that feather could pass into the next world. What does your heart weigh today? In a world built on consumption, speed, and performance, our hearts become heavy with what is not ours. We carry inherited fears, false dreams, borrowed values. We forget that heaviness is not a sign of depth. It is a symptom of dissonance. You feel it, don't you? The dis-ease that comes not just from pain, but from disalignment. When your inner truth whispers one thing, and your outer life demands another. That quiet ache when you say yes while your soul says no. That slow, aching erosion of wonder when you trade stillness for noise. This is how Ma'at is lost, not in one great act, but in 1,000 small betrayals of the self. And yet, it is also how she returns, not in one grand miracle, but in the slow, steady remembrance of those who choose resonance over repetition, who remember that to live in truth is not to be perfect, it is to be precise, to tune the instrument of the self to the music that never stopped playing, only became harder to hear. Hermes called the universe a living organism, a conscious field where every gesture ripples, where every intention is recorded, not in judgment, but in continuity. This is not karma as punishment. It is rhythm as response. You plant with thought. You harvest with emotion. And Ma'at is the invisible equilibrium that ensures every seed receives its echo. So I ask you, what seeds are you planting today with your focus, with your speech, with your silence? What music plays beneath your actions? Is it a borrowed song, or the remembered hum of your soul? We think of the cosmos as far away, indifferent, mechanical. But the cosmos is not above you, it is within you. As above, so below. Not as metaphor, as law, as rhythm, as breath. And if you are out of sync, the universe is not punishing you. It is inviting you to retune. You don't need to build temples of stone. Your presence is a temple. Your awareness is the altar. Every moment you act from stillness, from clarity, from love, you restore Ma'at. Not just in yourself, but in the collective field. Yes, the world is heavy now. But that is not a sign of doom. It is the moment before exhale. Before the heart lightens. Before the rhythm resets. The ancients knew this pulse. They lived by it. And though the world told you to forget, the memory remains. Coded in your breath, in your bones, in your longing. You are not disconnected from the great pattern. You are the thread reawakening. So let me ask again, where have you allowed dissonance to masquerade as duty? Where have you sacrificed resonance for approval? And what happens when you no longer do? In the next part, we move deeper into the memory of Atlantis. Not as myth, but as mirror. Not to recreate it, but to reclaim what its fall was meant to teach us. Because Ma'at is not just a law. It is a prophecy. They called it a myth. A fable told by philosophers, encoded in allegory, softened for polite company. But deep in your bones, in the ache behind your search for meaning, you know Atlantis was not a story. It was a memory, and memory does not die. It waits. Plato did not invent Atlantis. He remembered it, not as fantasy but as echo. A whisper passed through Egyptian priests to Solon, to Critias, to the soul of a world that had begun to forget. He described not just the geography, rings of water and land, but the balance. A civilization rooted in harmony between soul and science, spirit and substance. Where temples amplified frequency. Where knowledge was not separated from reverence. Where technology emerged not from conquest, but from communion. And then it fell. Not because of gods or comets, but because of a fracture in the invisible law. A break from Ma'at. Atlantis fell the way all great things fall. From within. Not in a single day, though the story says so, but in cycles. First a forgetting, then a distortion, then a hunger that outgrew its purpose. Sound familiar? We look back and wonder how such knowledge could be lost. How temples powered by sound, light, and crystalline resonance could vanish beneath waves. How wisdom carved into vibration could be silenced. But we forget. Nothing vanishes by chance. Memory is buried when its existence threatens the structures that rise in its absence. Atlantis was not destroyed to erase truth. It was destroyed because truth was no longer lived. And so I ask you, what part of your life reflects that same arc? What once sacred impulse have you let collapse beneath the weight of survival? Where have you traded alignment for efficiency, presence for productivity? The Atlanteans were not gods. They were human, but they remembered more than we do now. They lived with awareness of the unseen, respect for the subtle. They tuned themselves like instruments, and then they forgot. They twisted their technology toward control. They fused desire with will, abandoning wisdom, and what was meant to amplify the divine became a weapon against it. We have done the same. Our tools glow with light but deliver noise. Our networks span the globe but numb the soul. We speak of progress, but cannot sleep. We digitize our knowing, outsource our instincts, label mysticism as madness. We build higher, faster, brighter. But are we more whole? Atlantis whispers not to our pride, but to our pain. Not to our ambition, but to our yearning. Because something in us remembers the balance. The pulse of harmony between mind and heart, earth and sky, matter and spirit. This memory is not poetic. It is prophetic. You see it in the patterns that repeat. The fall of one civilization echoes in the trembling of another. Every age of light is followed by shadow. And every collapse, if it is seen rightly, becomes an initiation. What if we are not witnessing the end, but the echo? What if your attraction to crystals, sound, vibration, energy is not trend, but recall? What if your sensitivity, your inability to cope with the chaos of modern life, is not weakness but remembrance? You may be carrying a frequency older than this world. You may be a fragment of Atlantis, seeded into this age, not to rebuild its temples, but to restore its ethos. Not to look back but to live forward aligned. Because the fall is not the end. It is the curve in the spiral. And Atlantis, like Ma'at, does not disappear. It waits. So again I ask, what truth inside you has sunk beneath the waves? What light did you dim because the world told you it was too much? And what happens when you begin to rise again? Not with force, but with frequency. In the next part, we enter the inner chamber of remembrance. Beyond Atlantis, beyond Egypt, into the Akasha, the place where every memory is stored, every soul contract written, every purpose traced in light. Because what was lost in the flood can still be found. Inside you, not every library is built of stone. Not every record is carved in clay. Some memories are kept not in words, but in vibration. They do not speak to the mind, but to the marrow. You have felt them, those quiet moments of knowing you cannot explain. The ache when you hear an ancient name. The pull toward a symbol you have never studied. The tears that rise at a song whose language you do not speak. This is not fantasy. It is access. And the field you are touching has always been there. The ancients called it Akasha, the ether, the breath between things, the memory behind matter. Not a book, not a place, but a living frequency where all things are written, not by ink, but by intent. Your life is there, not just this one, all of them, the patterns, the lessons, the imprints, the choices made and the cycles repeated, the dreams deferred and the gifts waiting to be claimed. It is all there, not locked, not hidden, just waiting for you to remember how to listen. You've already touched it, haven't you? In dreams that felt more like return than invention. In sudden clarity that emerged not from thinking, but from stillness. In moments where you knew without knowing why. That wasn't your imagination. That was your memory. The Akashic records are not reserved for saints or mystics. They do not require robes, rituals, or rare initiation. They require stillness, sincerity, a willingness to be changed. Because the moment you tune into the records, you stop being a victim of fate and start becoming a co-creator of meaning. But make no mistake, this is not about escape. The Akasha does not exist to tell you who you were so you can feel important. It exists to show you what you've carried, and how you are repeating it. It reveals the loops, the unfinished songs, the energies you've brought with you, again and again, until they are completed. Karma is not punishment. It is resonance. A tone played too long, seeking resolution. A note that only ends when it is heard. And so I ask you, what patterns keep finding you? What lessons knock at your door in different guises? Who or what keeps reappearing? Not to haunt you, but to remind you. Perhaps that difficult relationship is not a curse, but a contract. Perhaps your fear of speaking is not from this life, but from another where truth costs too much. Perhaps your gifts, the ones you downplay, disown, disregard, are the very tools your soul chose for this round. What if your longing is a compass? The Akashic Field does not judge. It reflects. It shows you what you came to complete. Not as obligation, but as possibility. You are not bound to repeat the past, but you cannot transform what you will not name. This is why remembrance matters. Because when you remember, you reclaim choice. You stop walking in circles. You stop mistaking the test for the truth. You begin to live as the author of your becoming, not in defiance of your past, but in conversation with it. The mystics knew this. They didn't memorize dogma. They learned to listen, to shift their frequency, to align their awareness with the field of memory. Not with force, but with presence. That is what the Akashic records respond to, not expertise but embodiment. So again I ask, what truth have you been sensing but afraid to speak? What dream have you shelved as fantasy, though it pulses like remembrance? What would change if you trusted the voice within, not as ego but as echo? You are not a blank slate. You are a continuity, a wave of consciousness, folding and unfolding, across time. And the blueprint is not etched in stone, it is etched in light, which means it can evolve, which means it is never too late to return to resonance. In the next part, we will explore how this remembrance becomes action, how the soul's memory, once reawakened, becomes a tool for transformation, not to escape the world, but to transmute it. Because remembering is not the end. It is the beginning of everything. Remembering is not enough. The soul does not awaken for nostalgia. It does not lift the veil just to admire what was. When memory rises, it brings with it responsibility. A pulse that asks not only what have you been, but what will you now become? You have felt the shift, haven't you? The old life no longer fits, the roles feel hollow, the conversations brittle. You stand in places that once made sense and now feel like echoes. You are not broken. You are breaking through. This is transmutation, the moment when remembrance becomes embodiment, when vibration becomes choice, when the truths you once sensed become the ground beneath your steps. But it is not always graceful. The path of integration is not a clean ascension. It spirals. It burns. It strips. To remember is to disrupt. To feel the old skin flake away not because you chose it, but because you finally stopped clinging. And so I ask you, what have you outgrown, but still where to feel safe? What dream did you bury not because it failed, but because it asked too much of your becoming? What sacred discomfort have you avoided because you feared its fire? You cannot carry the new with hands still full of the old. Memory is not meant to decorate you. It is meant to deconstruct you. The Atlantean mind does not awaken in books. It awakens in the stillness between breakdown and decision, in the silence after the sob, in the moment where you finally exhale the lie and inhale the truth, even if your life unravels in response. Because that unraveling is sacred. The mystics called it the dark night. The alchemists called it nigredo, the burning before gold, the decomposition before clarity. This is the phase where the blueprint begins to animate, where the Akashic echo becomes the current shaping your choices. It is not enough to know you are a soul. You must act like it. And this does not mean perfection. It means precision, presence, honesty. It means pausing when the world rushes, saying no when it trembles your core, speaking yes when your voice shakes, living not for approval but for alignment, because that is how the field responds. When you live from soul, the universe rearranges. Synchronicities increase, not as decoration but as navigation. Doors appear where once there were walls. Teachers arrive not with titles, but with timing. And the world, once static, becomes a mirror that moves with you. This is not magic. It is physics, spiritual physics. As your frequency shifts, so too does your field. You attract not what you want, but what you are. And the more you embody the resonance of your blueprint, the more the path reveals itself, not ahead of you, but beneath your next true step. So again I ask, where are you waiting for permission that your soul has already granted? Where are you holding back your light, fearing it will burn instead of warm? What would your life look like if you stopped asking whether you're ready, and began living as if you are? The systems around you are not ready for awakened souls. That is why they try to sedate you. But the moment you begin to live your remembering, you become a node of coherence in the collective field. You don't need to convince. You only need to embody, because frequency is contagious, and one aligned presence can shift a room, family, a generation. In the next and final part, we will stand at the threshold of return. We will gather the fragments, Egypt, Atlantis, Akasha, the fire, the rhythm, and bring them home, not to a past we recreate, but to a future we remember into being. Because the new world does not descend from heaven. It is dreamed through you. You've come far. But this is not an end. It is a return to the beginning. A place before language, before lineage, before forgetting. A place where you are not name or role or story, but note, tone, breath. Where your life is not measured in time, but in resonance. Where the question is no longer, who am I? But what song do I carry? You've remembered Egypt, not as a nation, but as mirror. A geography of the soul where heaven touches earth through form. Where temples were not buildings, but bodies aligned to stars. You've remembered Atlantis, not as myth, but as caution. A reflection of what happens when power outruns wisdom, when the sacred is mined instead of lived. You've remembered the Akasha not as fantasy, but as field. The quiet place where your lifetimes ripple, waiting for you to hear their hum. You've stood in the fire. You've listened to the silence behind the noise. You've watched the old skins fall, the old truths fracture, the old dreams dissolve. And now you stand here not empty but whole, not certain but aware. This is the heart of the esoteric path, not knowledge but knowing, not escape but embodiment, not answers but deeper questions. Because truth is not a destination. It is a direction. So I ask you now, what will you carry forward? Not from fear, but from freedom. Not to convince, but to remember. Will you dare to speak what others forget? To move in harmony where others chase speed? To listen so deeply, the world around you begins to retune? You were never here to survive the world as it is. You were here to awaken the world as it remembers. Not through argument, through resonance. Not through dominance, through coherence. Not through prophecy, but presence. And presence is what you are. Let the systems fall. Let the names fade. Let the roles unravel. Let what is true remain, not in word, but in rhythm. Not in belief, but in breath. The Creator, the source Hermes whispered of, is not far. It is within the field, within the form, within the moment you choose to align. So this is not goodbye. This is a continuation. A soft hand on your shoulder in the dark. A voice that is not voice saying, remember, return, begin. Thank you for walking this path. Not alone, but with every soul who listens with the inner ear, sees with the eye behind the eye, and remembers without needing to prove. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. And it begins now.